All righty. Well, our speaker tonight is Allison Poklemba, who is an herbalist, educator, and nature-based book publisher from Backcountry Press. Her work explores the relationship between plants, people, and place. She teaches herbalism as co-director of Dandelion Herbal Center, with an emphasis on ecological awareness, traditional uses of plants, and respectful gathering practices. Seaweeds hold a special place in Allison's heart, and she spent decades studying and working with them, weaving together hands-on experience, scientific understanding, and traditional knowledge. Please join me in welcoming Allison as she tells us about sea vegetables of the Pacific Coast.
Hello, hello. Is this good? Microphones are awkward. Well, thank you. Thanks for welcoming me. This has been on my to-do list to share this talk with this audience for, I kid you not, 20 years. So I am so glad to be checking this off my to-do list. Thank you. Let's see what our plan is for this evening. Well, I think first what we need to address is, are we talking about plants or algae? We'll look at how to be safe when you are out there meeting the plants or algae. We'll find out what they are, know the rules, understand the tides, and we will meet a wide variety of sea vegetables. Let's take a look. I'm also looking to see where a clock is so I don't talk to you for too long.
Down there towards the restroom.
Okay, I can't really see it, but that's okay. You tell me if I'm talking to him. Oh, I see it. So many of you might know my husband, Michael Kaufman. Apparently, I just learned he holds the record for bringing in the largest numbers of attendees to a talk like this. And we have been working quite hard to help bring this green blur, the great green blur out there of plants, into better focus for people in various ways. And what I'd like to do this evening is to help us to bring that maroon, black, purple, grayish blur into better focus for all of us. We're going to start picking out some things from that jumble there. And I love to do this in person, so I encourage you to practice some nugget of what you pick up this evening and take it out to a tide pool near you this spring. We have some fabulous low tides coming up. And thank you to everyone who is Zooming in this evening. Yes, you too, you and you and you, please take this information outside too. And I hope that wherever you are, if there are kids in your world, that you will also bring them to the tide pools with you, because they are just filled with wonder. So let's see if this video works. And we'll just take a little look around. And what you're looking at here is some pretty incredible stuff in terms of biodiversity. We are really lucky to live in a place here on the north coast of California where seaweed species that exist primarily to the north cross holdfasts with species that exist primarily to the south. And because of that, we have so many different wondrous things to meet and look at and enjoy. And I just love this quote from Jacques Cousteau that the sea, once it casts its spell, holds one in its net of wonder forever. Raise your hand if you feel lucky to be living next to these amazing places. Yes. Turns out though, oh, we have some Zoom hand raises too. Wonderful. It turns out that seaweed though has not always had the best reputation as something enjoyable to see, let alone eat or experience with your senses. This is a book that when my children were a little younger, picked up randomly at the Humboldt County Library. Senses at the seashore, feel the saltwater breeze, listen to the waves, smell the stinky seaweed. But it turns out seaweed, thankfully, is having a moment where now we are seeing seaweed products becoming quite trendy, if not quite expensive. We see this in body care products. If you go to your local grocery store right here in Arcata, you'll see like seaweed shampoo and all sorts of different things. We see this in trendy foodstuffs, very trendy foodstuffs. You can purchase just straight up seaweed cubes to include in your smoothie or other things. You can buy seaweed that's just in capsule form for quite a lot of money. I think that one of the ways that people are most accustomed to eating seaweed, especially kids, is as these seaweed snacks that come in so much plastic packaging, though they're really good in terms of tasty. But we have this seaweed is Nori here. Pyropia is the Latin name, and I'm going to show you, we have about 20 different species of Pyropia that grow right here on our shores. So seaweed over the past 10 years or so, it's been so fun for me as an enthusiast of many years to see such positive attention on seaweed, and especially with local projects that are happening. This is a project that's been going on for a couple of years. That's a partnership between the Food Sovereignty Lab on campus, Sunken Seaweed, Reef Check, which is an organization that helps to monitor kelp bed health and remove sea urchins. You guys are probably all familiar with Cal Poly's seaweed farming projects that are happening in the Bay, which is really exciting. And that we have a local company here, Sunken Seaweed, that is growing edible seaweed on shore, actually, in this tumble culture type process. And you can buy this at the grocery store, at the farmer's market. It's very exciting. But it turns out that seaweed is actually an ancient food. It's an easily accessible, highly nutritious, locally abundant food staple for coastal people around the globe. And some theories propose that it's played a key role in the development of the human brain because of its exceptional nutrient content. And when we look back in time just a bit, not quite to ancient times, but slightly more modern, and we think about eating seaweed, pictures like this might come to mind if we're thinking about Asian culture. This is a traditional woodblock print from Japan of harvesting practices of the Nori, the Pyropia. But if we go to the far Atlantic shores, there's a different sort of outlook about seaweed. This is a picture of families during the potato famine in Ireland who were really hard up for some food and finding, though, that seaweed was always a reliable source. And there's a phrase that still remains, which if someone has died with a piece of seaweed in their mouth, that they have died in poverty. So some different outlooks on seaweed consumption. And this is a chart that's showing us how much seaweed people in different places are consuming over the course of a year. We can see Japan tops the charts there, and also the percentage of the seaweed being consumed in that area that is actually grown or gathered in that area. And we can see that in North America, less than 1% of what we are consuming is actually being produced or gathered in North America. Though that number is going up because I'm sure you all have been hearing about more and more seaweed farming projects that are happening. So in culture like Japan, seaweed is kind of viewed as just another vegetable. And so that's one thing that I like to teach people about when we're looking at what sort of seaweeds growing can we eat? How do we use them? It's not a big deal. Nothing special needed. This is just another vegetable, which is quite beautiful and a fun adventure to gather. And at least in some areas, I know there's been some drastic changes with what's happening with the kelp beds, and we'll get into that a little bit, but in some places quite abundant. Who here has eaten locally grown seaweed? That's great. I'm seeing like 80% of our room, and one hand raised on Zoom. Thank you, Maya. So let's bring this blur into a little bit more focus here and address our first question. Are seaweeds a type of plant? Well, here's our beautiful tree of life. And it turns out that seaweeds are in a group that precedes plant life. So you may have learned back in 7th grade or college biology class that we have the reds, the greens, and the browns. And it is the green group of seaweed that are the ancestors of all of our land plants. It can be hard to know what to call the parts of a seaweed. They do look similar to plants, some of them at least, without being plants. It looks like they have roots. It looks like they have leaves and stems. But just to get some basic terminology down, the whole body of the seaweed is called its thallus. Instead of having leaves, they have blades. Instead of having roots, they have what we call a holdfast. And the holdfast serves a different purpose than a root. Its job is not to absorb nutrients. Its job is to hold that seaweed in place on whatever substrate it has chosen to make its existence on. Seaweed diversity. How many different seaweed species are we talking about that exist out there? Turns out that there are an unknown number of species of algae in the world. Isn't that great? We don't know something. I love that. There are between 200,000 and 800,000 species of marine microalgae, only 50,000 of which have been described. And these microalgae are producing much of the oxygen that we are enjoying. Let's take a collective breath of gratitude together. Thank you, microalgae. So we do have, though, about 800 species of marine macroalgae that exist on our shores between California and Alaska. And it's the macroalgae that we're talking about that are seaweed. People often will refer to seaweed as kelp and vice versa. Kelps are what we call the large seaweeds that are in that brown group, the Phaeophyta. Who's relying on the seaweed? Well, hello, my name is the wandering meatloaf, otherwise known as the gumbo chitin. Seaweeds are the nutritional base for many shallow water food chains. Don't you just love the gumbo chitin? Like another friend you get to say hi to when you go out and visit the seaweed. I just think they're so cool. So seaweeds are also providing architecture to house and protect associated fishes and invertebrates. This hermit crab's shell is being encrusted in a red coralline algae. That's what those little nubby things in the red crest are there. So when you are headed out to the tide pools, let's just take a look at safety for a second. I don't want anyone's injury on my conscience. Please do go with a friend. Never turn your back on the ocean. We know how unpredictable it could be. Be lookouts for each other. If you are looking at gathering any seaweed, it's pretty slippery out there, right? We do not want you slicing into yourself at all. Please bring with yourself scissors or a knife that does indeed fold up. And looking at your feet, it pains me to see people going barefoot in the tide pools. Please wear not just like your Keen sandals or Tevas, but shoes that actually do cover your whole foot. Rain boots, old sneakers, surf booties are great. There's some really sharp stuff out there. We all agreed? Okay, good. Also, it's important to know what the rules are if you were thinking about collecting anything anywhere. Know where the marine protected area and marine reserve areas are. National wildlife refuges, national parks and monuments. Most state parks, not all, but most state parks do not want you to collect seaweed. And also be aware of tribal reservation areas, of course, unless you're a member. What are the rules in California for gathering seaweed anyway? Well, each state has their own set of rules. In California, this recreational gathering is monitored by regulated by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. The season is open all year. That's not the case for every state, but that's really enjoyable for us here. The daily limit is 10 pounds wet weight. And that can add up pretty quickly because seaweed is mostly water. And when it's dry, it weighs virtually nothing. When it's wet, it can weigh a whole bunch. So if you are really into collecting, it's helpful to have a little like postage scale that you can hang a bag off of to see how much you've collected. And there is no recreational gathering of sea palm, which it turns out is quite delicious and has been over harvested. Surf grass or eelgrass, which are not seaweeds but are actually flowering plants. I don't know why you would want to collect those anyway. Bulk kelp harvest has been prohibited. I could not find what was happening currently because the mandate prohibiting that expired on January 1st of 2026. But I would not encourage anyone to harvest bulk kelp. There are several seaweeds that we will meet this evening who have been more heavily impacted by those crazy purple urchins than others, and bulk kelp has been hit really hard. So this is one that we just let be. These are the marine protected areas. You can easily find that map. If you find yourself wandering north, beyond the California state line to Oregon, know that you are only allowed to collect living seaweed there between March 1st and June 15th. And there's a daily limit of 1 gallon. So that is measured by your bucket size. So one of the resources that I put together and give to my students is this little laminated card that shares with you simple ID tips and simple practices for ethical and sustainable gathering. I have some of these available at Karen's table up front if you're interested in one of those. Obviously, avoid polluted areas. You're going to want to gather seaweed in the most pristine waters that you can find. It can be helpful to look at I think it's the Coastal Commission that grades the beaches, grades the water quality at different beaches, so you can easily find that information. Think about tide pool etiquette. One of the things that I see that is quite damaging to all of the other critters that are sharing that tide pool space is when folks go out with a walking stick. That puts a lot of pressure in a very discrete spot where you could easily crush other living things. So be aware of that. When do you head out there? Well, now's the time, folks, to be looking at your tide charts because we have some amazing low tides that are coming up. Really, the best low tides of the whole year are in the late spring and early summer. The time and tide wait for no person, so they may be at like 5:30 in the morning on a Wednesday, you know. So the NOAA site, they have a whole tide prediction site. This is a very easy spot to find out what the tides are doing in specific locations. And we are looking for those spring tides. Those are the ones that have the largest fluctuation between the high tide and the low tide mark. You can see this is coming up. This is June 16th, a negative 2.39 feet in Trinidad. I put that on your calendar so you can plan to have that morning off. That's going to be pretty great. So seaweed exists in this very special zone that we call the intertidal, which is this place that is a moisture and temperature gradient that is covered up at the highest tides and revealed at the lowest tides. There's some seaweeds we refer to as being subtidal, meaning even at the lowest tides, we never see their entire body. Some are still attached way down deep. And then we do have one seaweed in particular that we will look at that almost exists at the very top margin of the intertidal where it likes to be splashed. So it's not always just covered up, it likes to be in the splash zone. But the way I like to talk about where to find seaweed in this gradient is that everything exists in its right place. Here's a very old picture of me looking at the seaweed. And I've created this simple map, which I also have as a free download on our Backcountry Press website, if that's handy for you. And I modeled this after one that I found in an old book that I thought was so helpful to have a simple drawing that showed you the predictable places where the different species of favorite sea vegetables, just favorite edible seaweeds exist. And so I'm going to be highlighting with each species here where on this map they are living. And with each different seaweed that you meet out there, I feel like understanding the texture of that seaweed is really key to identification. The colors may change, the shapes may change, the size may change, but it always exists in a predictable place with a predictable texture. So shake hands with your seaweed friends. Are you ready for the tour? Ready to jump into the tide pools? Yes. Well, let's start with that upper intertidal zone, the part that is closest to the shore. And here we have, I think, the seaweed that most people have probably tried, and that is the nori. I learned this originally as porphyra, but it has been reclassified as pyropia. We have 188 or so different species worldwide. This is a favorite of seaweed eating folks from coast to coast. And here we have about 20 or so different species of pyropia, of nori, of chagel that live on our north coast. I've also pulled these maps from iNaturalist to just give you a little peek at what distribution looks like. So this is one that is also a European favorite. And laver is the European name. Nori would be the Japanese name. Maybill, Kashaya pomo for sea leaf. And oftentimes these can really look like a big old leaf dangling off the rocks. This is also a seaweed that you can think of as being like an annual as opposed to a perennial. You may come to a tide pool where you have collected this in the late spring and early summer. You may come back in January and see nothing on that rock. Where did it go? There are some species that practice what we call an alternation of generations. So part of their life, they're looking like this, and the other half in this case, this is existing, it's kind of holding up for the winter as like a little thread inside of a shell. And then come spring, it sends out its right gametes that go and then inhabit the rocks along the shore again. So traditionally, if you were someone that was living inland, you would need some sort of indicator for when it was time to head to the coast to collect your store of seaweed for the year. And different tribal groups have used different indicators. Down on the Sonoma County coast, people traditionally use the grass growing as an indicator of when this would be a great time to collect the maybill, the nori, the laver, the pyropia. We know that the hills in California turn brown in the summertime. Then it's too late. It's really past its prime. Up in British Columbia, the Shishian tribe uses nettle as the indicator species inland. When the nettle is high, that's when it's time to head to the coast for the seaweed camp to do the collecting. So here's an example of a rock just coated in the nori that would be empty of it for half of the year. To note about the nori is that it is very thin. When you are touching this and wondering what texture am I looking for, it has a stretchiness to it, almost like a thin latex glove, only it is also transparent, translucent. It also, because it's so high up in the intertidal zone, it dries out very quickly. and can almost look like a stretched, tight, dry skin over the rocks. But you flip it over where it's still a little moist and has sprung back to life. So I have for you up here a little seaweed touch tank that if you're interested in feeling the textures of some of these after we're done chatting away, you are welcome to come up. I will just share with you here that, this was just totally dried in my bag. And even when you're eating your dried seaweed, you give it a little moisture and it's like it's sprung back to life. That was it. So looking at this, like I said, this is one that I would consider more of an annual type of plant. So the season for finding this in its prime condition is really from late April into July. And you'll notice around the edges, it starts to deteriorate as the summer progresses. And what's happening there is that the entire thing is just dissolving into spores that are headed out into the ocean for the other half of their life cycle. And here's what that would look like these little thread-like things. This is just a picture of what this looks like being farmed in China. And so the nori snacks that you are eating, that you might buy a big thing of from Costco, that nori is being farmed in either China or South Korea. And typically that's happening on land. So gathering this, the hold fast for this seaweed is not readily apparent. It's like a little tiny shell-like suction cup that when you are gathering this, you are wanting to make sure you leave behind so that this can keep growing. And it turns out that seaweeds, we're talking about this very short prime growing season that's kind of centered around the summer solstice. They grow incredibly quickly, and for that reason are being really pointed to as a sustainable food source, especially for things like protein, as we know how resource intensive it is to grow meat for protein on land. So you're using scissors to give it a little haircut and leave the base behind. Again, the seaweed is also home for lots of little critters, like especially little snails. And so using a salad spinner is a great way to clean this up before you're taking it home, because I'm sure no one likes to munch on a little snail shell. So one thing with gathering seaweed is that this is something that is labor intensive and that you need to plan ahead for. But I've been guiding groups of people to tide pools to gather seaweed for 25 years, and I'm always warning people against their eyes being larger than their stomachs, sort of a situation where you just take little samples of things. We're not gathering everything you're going to eat for the next 10 years. You also have to clean and dry it, and I'll show you a little bit about drying at the end. So moving on to our next seaweed to meat, or another seaweed vegetable, I think of this as like the best buddy of the nori. They love growing together, and that is the sea lettuce, ulva. And we have several different ulva species that grow along our north coast. These inhabit the same area in the upper intertidal zone. So very upper in this case, that sometimes you can even see this growing straight out of the sand in places where it's quite protected from strong wave action. Here's your distribution map. This is a seaweed that people are enjoying all around the planet. And again, this is one that acts sort of like an annual that totally covers rocks during the spring and summer and is absent from the rocks during the winter months. It is, you can see through it pretty easily, just like the nori. It has a very similar thin feel to it. This is one that, again, you're just giving it a little haircut with some scissors, being sure to leave that hold fast behind. The difference here, obviously, is the color. Sea lettuce is like the most perfect common name for this algae. The difference in texture is that the nori is quite stretchy. The sea lettuce tears very easily. Okay, so still hanging out in the upper intertidal zone, we move on to bladderwrack, rockweed, fucus. And this is a picture of the seaweed, not from a tide pool, but from a bathtub. And those are my friend Christine's toes. She's right over there. She sent me this picture from Ireland, where she had the great pleasure of experiencing thalassotherapy or ocean therapy. And bathing with seaweed is actually quite enjoyable, so I encourage it. So here's what this looks like growing in Ireland. We have our fucus disticus distribution here. And here's what it looks like growing on our rocky shores. This was named Fucus gardneri until several years ago. This is a perennial that grows in the upper intertidal zone. And so when harvesting or gathering from a perennial, super important to leave the base of that intact so that it can keep on growing. And so what we're doing, that red line here is where I would give this a little trim with my scissors and just collect those swollen tips. I call this fucus mucus because there is so much slime that exists in those swollen tips. Seaweed and mucilage are two things that go hand in hand. We generally know that, right? Seaweed can be quite slimy. That slime, though, is wonderful for our bodies. That's a whole bunch of soluble fiber that you are ingesting when you ingest that slime. This, though, I think of as kind of like the aloe of the sea. So if you get a sunburn at the beach, you can be opening up one of these swollen tips, just like a little aloe fillet, and applying that to your burned or irritated skin. And these tips really do puff up. And when they puff up like that, they're going to be at their prime slime time. So this one I'm sharing more as a novelty because I just find it so beautiful. Zoom in a little bit here. This is the sea sac or sea grapes, Halosachion glandiforme. We know common names can be confusing, right? Here are all things that are called sea grapes. Here's where this exists along our coast. It likes, we're moving a little closer into the mid-intertidal zone here. It's a really fun one to see. I think of this sort of like how mushrooms will start out as little buttons, and they are exactly as they will be in their larger form. It's like all of their cells just expand. I feel like these start off the same way. They look like these tiny little balloons and then just expand out as they're growing. And these are a fun one to collect here and there as a little novelty edible seaweed, and that you already have a perfect little pouch here that you could stuff with something. Like if you like making stuffed shells or stuff like bell peppers, something like that, this would be really fun to fill with, say, your ricotta parsley combination and bake in some marinara sauce. Plus, they're just very beautiful. Moving along into the mid-intertidal zone, we have our Turkish washcloth, which I have some in our little touch tank up here if you want to feel this in a bit. If you enjoy the flavor of oysters, this might be your favorite edible seaweed. It's also called grapestone, Mastocarpus papillatus, and that papillatus refers to the bumpy nature of this. So this is a really fun one to use as like a loofah or a washcloth in the bath or the shower. The female phallus of this is much bumpier than the male. Here's, maybe I showed that already. This has a smaller relative, Mastocarpus jardinii, which you see just a ton of in our tide pools around here. I'm sure you've noticed it. We call this the bushy Turkish washcloth. It's just kind of like a more diminutive version. it turns out that that black rubbery tar-like stuff that you see on the rocks surrounding this is just the other half of this seaweed's life cycle. Petrocellus is what the genus of this was until I think it was in the 1960s or 70s that people figured out that this is actually the same thing. And once you see that black tar spot, you're going to start noticing it everywhere. It's a seaweed. So a little more grandiose version of our Turkish washcloth is our Turkish towel, Chondrocanthus exasperatus. And we're starting to move here into the lower intertidal zone. This one is seriously bumpy. It's hard to find around Trinidad. I will see it washed up occasionally, and I give 2 thumbs up for wash-ups for external use. People will often ask, is it okay to eat the seaweed that I see washed up on the beach? I would say, unless, a storm has just happened and it's something large that you wouldn't be gathering anyway, maybe like the bullwhip kelp, I would say, okay, with caution. But in general, I would not consume seaweed that's just washed up on the beach. Though for external use, like using this in the bath or the shower kind of a thing, like a big giant washcloth or loofah, that is great. Look at the little bumps on that thing. And it can be quite big. This one is also very rich in the seaweed gels. And if you get really into cooking with seaweeds, this is a favorite for thickening like puddings and soups. And there's all sorts of fun pudding like desserts and custardy type things that you can make with the Turkish towel. That's not a seaweed. That is a chameleon. Well, this seaweed I refer to as rainbow leaf, and it's sort of like the chameleon of the tide pools because it can look so many different ways and be so many different colors. But remember, it's all about the texture. So people will always be pointing out different things. Is this the rainbow leaf? Yes. What about this one? Yes. This one? It sure is. And what unifies these is, oh, I have a little video here, so we can get that to play. Nope. Is that when this is underwater, it has a rainbow-like sheen to it. It's so distinct. It's almost like it has been, dipped in motor oil or something, though I guarantee you it hasn't. Mausiellus splendens, the splendid iridescent seaweed. The old genus name for this was Iridea, so you might see that in some old guidebooks. This has the texture of like a fruit roll-up. Or fruit leather, if you are younger generation. So this can look very different ways depending on what the wave action is. If this is growing somewhere where the water is very protected, this will grow quite large. And let's see. And if it's growing somewhere where it's getting a lot of wave action, it has this kind of vague heart-like shape. Either way is fine. Here's where it exists. However, if it looks warty, what's happening here is that each of those bumps that you see is a cluster where the spores are being produced. So those we let be. We're not collecting those. And eventually, those little bumps will open up and release the spores, and your seaweed will start to look like Swiss cheese anyway. So here's a favorite that people are generally familiar with. Wakame is the Japanese name. We know this also as winged kelp or ribbon kelp. It can be quite long. Alaria marginata, or a little shorter. And this likes to grow in places where there is a lot of wave action, where the water is almost like in a little channel, is rushing in and out in more of the lower intertidal zone. It's so beautiful, and I love just watching this one as the water is moving back and forth over it. It has these ruffly edges that you look at this and you think, you are so perfectly designed to live in this exact spot, the way the water flows over those ruffles. This one has some specialized blades at its base right here. These are called the sporophylls, and this is where the reproduction happens. This is where it's releasing its spores. This is another one that will exist for multiple years in the same spot. I did not pluck this from the rocks. I'm holding the holdfast there in my hand, but it had just washed up that way. So I thought it was a good example to show. So this one, when you are gathering this, you'll want to do that several feet above where the sporophylls are, so you're not interrupting its reproduction. And this is actually one of our fastest growing seaweeds. And you could, in theory, come back and gather a several foot section from the same individual several times throughout that growing season. Here's where that lives. And this is the Wakame, I think is, I'm sure you've had this, though it's the Asian variety in miso soup or in seaweed salad. That's the predominant seaweed. Have you noticed the color of seaweed salad? How it's like this fluorescent green color? This is not fluorescent green. What's the story there? Well, when you dip this in boiling water, it turns fluorescent green. Though many times the seaweed salad that you're having from the shop has dyes added to it to give it that color. And I love this. This is really showing off those sporophylls there, really shining as it's underwater. So again, it's a section of this that you're gathering, leaving behind the several feet above the base with those sporophylls. And this is one that you can find and see and go visit in the tide pools year round, but harder to get to during those winter months when the ocean is more rough. Okay, I have just a couple more species here for you. Kombu is another one that folks are generally familiar with. Again, this is like the Asian name. This is a different variety than grows on the opposite side of the Pacific. Laminaria seychellii. I love this picture. This is, I took this out on the Lost Coast, and it's like to me, this reminds me of like an ocean garden. This tends to grow where the water can be quite rough, again, moving back and forth in and out where the water is moving quite quickly. You can see how the whole structure of it is sort of like an arm attached to the rock, and the blade is like a hand that moves back and forth with the water. Here's where that lives. Here, I feel like seaweeds are kind of like a mermaid with hair. Like they look the best when they're underwater. It can be hard to be, coming up out of the water and have everything just lay flat to fully appreciate them. So check out the difference between this picture, which I took in the same spot, as this picture. A little more purple in this one, right? The urchins have moved in, and we have gotten these areas that we call urchin barrens. And for that reason, this is one of the seaweeds that has been most impacted by the urchins, this Laminaria seychellii. This is one that I am asking people not to collect. Yes, it's delicious. Please let it be. What happened with these urchins anyway? Well, they had a huge population surge starting in about 2013. And what happened is an ecological disaster. 95% of kelp forests being lost in predominantly Sonoma and Mendocino County, though Humboldt and Del Norte have been affected as well. Here's an aerial image on the left. These are, this is bull kelp. This is not the laminaria. This is bull kelp, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. 2008 on the left and 2019 on the right. Why did this happen? Well, it was a bit of a perfect storm. We have a natural cycle that does occur with sea stars called sea star wasting syndrome, where it's almost like they just start dissolving right on the rocks. Fine, this happens occasionally, things rebalance, but we had some other factors that happened. So during the sea star wasting syndrome, literally billions of sunflower stars died. These are, I believe they have about 20 legs, sea stars, that can be about the size of a trash can lid. And they are one of two natural predators of those purple urchins. Anyone know what the other natural predator is? Sea otter. Yeah. Do we have many sea otters around these neck of the woods? No. So I personally have not seen a sunflower star in about 10 years, though there have been spottings around, which is good, of little baby ones. The other thing that happened is that there was a warm blob, as it was referred to, in the ocean. And so there was, even though it was slight, still a temperature rise in the ocean. And that was followed by this extended El Nino conditions, which were also warming ocean temperatures. And wow, warming ocean temperatures make seaweed less resilient. And it turns out it is really hard to starve an urchin. They basically turn into zombies just waiting for something to eat. You cannot starve them out. And so they just ate everything in sight. And the seaweed were not quite strong enough to fight back, though with the efforts of the kelp guardians, reef check, etc., urchins are being very systematically removed in certain places to keep refugia for seaweed and other critters. And there is some progress being made. So there's a whole film about this that's coming up, and I wanted to put in the plug here for Humboldt Surf Riders Ocean Night, which is coming up on April 23rd, 6:30 at the Arcata Theater Lounge. Well, they will be screening the film Sequoias of the Sea. And this is all about what happened in Fort Bragg and how the decline of the kelp beds off the Mendocino coast impacted so many different aspects of life. So I'll see you there. So while I'm encouraging people not to collect the Laminaria sinclairii at all, we do have a really lovely substitute. I refer to this as the thin leaf combo, Laminaria sinclairii. This grows a little differently. This actually has, you can see it's like a much more dense cluster. This actually has a whole rhizome situation going on with this holdfast, and it likes to exist along shores where the sand builds up a whole lot during part of the year and then is also just like disappears during the winter months. And it does really well there. We have a lot of this around Trinidad, and I have some in our little touch tank here if you would like to feel it. The texture of this is also quite fruit leather or fruit roll-up, like leathery, we would call it. Here's where that exists. This next seaweed, speaking about the texture piece, I often tell people that this is sort of like, it has a look like seersucker fabric. Pedophyllum sessile. I bet you know what sessile means, you plant folks. It means it doesn't have a stem. So this has no stipe to it. This grows straight off of the rock with its holdfast right in the middle. Here's that what that seersucker look is. And it grows in a rosette around that holdfast. This is one that's quite thick compared to some of the other ones that we have met so far. And it grows pretty deep in the intertidal zone. Here's where it exists. And this is one when I am leading some forays that folks will always come up and say, you know, I found everything on this list or on the little ID card that I shared with you, but where's the sea cabbage? And I'll say, look right under your feet. For some reason, it's really hard to pick out visually. It likes to kind of exist like on the lower side of a rock or in the shadows. It's kind of secretive. So here's a favorite. This one has several common names: sea oak, chain bladder, sea fern. And this one is just beautiful. And it has a bit of a different growth habit. What you're seeing here are that the shape of it there is filled with little gas-filled floats. So this is one that likes to float in from deep places. So here's someone from one of my classes who was out gathering some of this. And it looks pretty nondescript when you're just looking down at the surface of the water, but if the tide has receded enough, you'll see this in big swaths. I often see chunks of this washed up as I'm walking the beach. This is one where the base is typically subtidal. So what I'm zooming in on there is the base before it grows all those little floaty parts. And it looks like an oak leaf, doesn't it? Like a lobed oak leaf. And that's why this has the common name of sea oak. Here's where this exists. And these little gas-filled bladders, it's like a little chain of nematocysts, are quite crunchy and delicious straight from the ocean. This is one that I encourage people to take a little nibble of when you're out there in the tide pools. Some of these other things, like the nori that I shared with you, are incredibly chewy, and you have to be cooking with them in some way. This is one that is just totally scrumptious, straight, fresh as it is. Feather boa is an apt name for this favorite sea vegetable, Egregia menziesii. You're probably familiar with this one. It grows in long strands, and you just can't help but like drape it around your neck when you're at the beach. I know you do this too. This exists again, very similar to the alaria, the wakame, in a place that's pretty deep where the water is moving in and out. Here's where it lives. It's a perennial that can have quite the mighty holdfast. This has been growing from the same location for years and years. Yes, it is tasty. However, this is my favorite one to encourage people to take a bath with. All those little leaflets of the feather boa, when you bring them into the freshwater of your bathtub, the freshwater fills them up and they become little squirters. Your kids will love it. Look at that smile. Sea palm is delicious, it turns out, and that has been part of its demise. Sea palm, which I'm sure you recognize, it looks like a little perfect palm tree that's usually out in the splash zone, just getting absolutely hammered by waves. You'll be out at some place like Elk Head, looking down from the bluffs, watching this seaweed just get pounded, and there's something so elastic to it, it just like rebounds right back up. That whole phallus grows anew every single year. But where the spores are produced are on the little leaflets, like the palm fronds, in little ridges that require the splashing of those waves to land there and wash them down the ridges back into the ocean. And so because it turns out it is so tasty, like those fronds, when they are dried, they are like perfect little potato chips from the sea. It has been overly harvested. And as an annual, if you're harvesting the reproductive parts, you can see how that might impact the population. But it has been a really important food source for indigenous people throughout the coastal areas of California for time immemorial. It was also one of the first seaweeds that was described by science in the 1850s. And this is a picture that was actually on an old cover of the CNPS journal. Here's where it lives. Again, this is out on the rocks. You'll have a hard time even getting to this unless you are wearing the wetsuit and feeling exceptionally brave. You might see it growing in and among the mussel shells. That's a really great place where its spores will get caught and then they'll go right out of the mussel beds. Because it is an annual, the entire thing does let go from the rocks, from the mussel beds at the end of each summer. And it can be really tempting to just collect this off the beach. But this is our one seaweed that you are not allowed to collect, even if it has washed up. I have a friend who got a ticket for collecting a washed up piece of this out at the North Jetty. And she said to the game warden there, I didn't pick this. There's nowhere that this is growing right here. You know, that's just a sandy beach. And he said, it doesn't matter. I can't know that you didn't pick it. I'm sorry. So please don't collect it, even if it is washed up. I don't know. However, and this is sort of the irony here for me, is that people do have commercial permits to collect this. And with the commercial permit, you can collect this by the ton. Yeah. Here's bull kelp. Again, this is one that I am not encouraging you to collect, though I would encourage you to use this if it was a fresh beach wash up. This is one that is also an annual, like the sea palm. And so this will wash up with winter storms and can be quite fresh if you're getting it, seeing it right away. I love appreciating little tiny baby bull kelps that will grow higher up, sort of like accidentally in the tide pools, because you picture this being a subtidal seaweed. You're never going to see the base of the giant bull kelps unless you're out, you know, scuba diving or free diving. But look at these little ones. So again, yes, subtitle there. Here's where it is existing. And one thing that I love about iNaturalist is looking at what the common names are around the world for plants, algae, etc., that are oftentimes more, there's an ethnobotanical story there. And so there will be a wide variety of common names. And this is one, if we go back to the map, we can see this is stretching over towards Russia. And so it makes sense to just see those different names. And this is also my favorite Latin name for a seaweed, Nereocystis, in Greek means mermaid's bladder. And that's referring to this bulb that's at the top. Now, this is a little bit of a rare sight now to see these big tangles of these washing up, but who remembers when these were quite frequent, right? This is also a very important seaweed for all of its utilitarian uses throughout time. People making baskets, using this as vessels for holding food, water, etc. Craft projects galore. There was a summer where I got really into knitting with the bull kelp, which was a fun activity. Was that a clap? Thanks. If you've been at the beach, you've probably turned this into a kelp horn or shofar, if you will, which is pretty fun. Oh, this is also a little video, but it's not playing. I'm sorry. You just have to imagine the sound, Denise. There we go. So another use that I really love for these is collecting the tops of the ones that you find dried along the coast. So here's my son Silas and I collecting some of those along with some driftwood pieces, and you can turn these into really wonderful rattles. We've just met a whole bunch of seaweeds, and no one has put their hand in the air yet and said, well, are there any I can't eat? What about the poisonous ones? We don't have poisonous seaweeds here. There is an escaped ornamental that is making its way up from Southern California, which does have some toxicity to it. Escaped ornamental? How do we have an escaped ornamental? From saltwater aquarium that people have decided they don't want and dump out. But what we do have is acid kelp, Desmorestia. And this has a high sulfuric acid content. So it's not poisonous, it's not toxic, but it can be really irritating to your mouth, to give you a bad bellyache. So it's important to recognize what this one looks like. It's very flat. It looks like someone already pressed it in the pages of a book. It has this fern-like look to it. It also blends in really well. It's taking up this whole central portion right here. And because it's so flat, it can just adhere very easily to other things, like maybe something like those ribbon kelp or wakame. Here's what it looks like in hand. It's also called the color changing kelp because the acids that are in it, sometimes you'll see kind of a ring around where it's growing, where it's bleached the color from the other seaweeds that it's touching. If you happen to accidentally collect some of this in your little less than 10-pound bag that you're bringing home, you'll get home and then find that it has digested the other seaweeds that you have collected, literally turned them to mush. Where does this exist? Well, all over the place in that lower intertidal. And, I should tell you that my history with seaweed is that I have been visiting the same exact tide pools, the same exact week for the past 26 years, both on the Lost Coast and up in Trinidad. And throughout that time, I've noted some trends. We've had some things that we're seeing less of, some things like Pacific dulse, we're actually seeing a whole lot more of. Also seeing a whole lot more of the acid kelp in Trinidad. Here's where that lives. Okay, so just a couple pointers for you. I'm just about done of things to keep in mind if you are someone that is feeling like, you know what, I want to go out and try collect a little bit of my own seaweed. I don't need to buy my Nori snacks and all that plastic packaging. Though, no guilt if you're still doing that. Beware of the mini greenhouse effect. Seaweed likes to be kept cold. It starts to deteriorate very quickly if it gets warm. So if you're collecting it in a plastic bag, what a waste to then just leave that in the sun where it will turn to mush. You're going to need to think about drying your seaweed so that you can store it up. I like to store things in Ziploc bags or glass jars if I have enough and have enough space for those. But you're going to need to store it in something airtight once it's dry. We know how moist it can be around here. When you're laying your seaweed out to dry, it's a great time to look for hitchhikers, like that little periwinkle snail there. Here's the same tray of nori that I put out in the sun for maybe an hour. This dries very quickly. It's so thin. It's used to desiccating. This is how it's evolved, right? This is growing high up on the rocks. It's used to drying out at regular intervals. Also, look at how much it shrunk. Like I said, your seaweed is mostly water. You can also lay this out on a sheet, or if you have larger pieces, a clothesline is really wonderful. Just need to make sure to take it in before we have that marine layer that overtakes us in the late afternoon and evening on the coast. So all of these seaweeds are really wonderful, dried and included in whatever you're having. Just another vegetable. That's the refrain, right? You can see up here how quickly these do rehydrate. Trying not to drip water everywhere, but here's a piece of wakame that was dried in my bag just a few minutes ago. Put it in a little water and it pops right back to life. Just a few exceptions here to be aware of. One, I shared with you about the nori, that is super chewy. Well, the way around that is to roast it or like in a dry skillet. Or the way that this is traditionally eaten by indigenous people throughout the coast of California and the Pacific Northwest is to fry it in whatever fat you have available, even like a little coconut oil, and you get something that is like the most scrumptious, perfectly salted chip that happens to be about 35% protein. So once you're roasting it, then you can grind it up. And in this case, my friend Melissa was turning this into like a gamasio sprinkle. Just another vegetable. The other exception here is the sea oak. This is the one that has those little floating bladders, right? This one that's perfectly crunchy straight out of the ocean. This one I love to make a pickle with. Just a marinated pickle. Instead of drying it, it's crunchy and perfect as it is. You're just preserving it that way. And this is fun to do with friends. You can each make a jar. So one thing that I found over these past 26 years of teaching about seaweed is that there are some resources out there that I felt like needed to be created. And I'm not at all trying to be too self-promotion-y for you, but here are some things that I've put together that are available if this piqued your interest and you want to go a little deeper with it. I have a Sea Vegetables of the Pacific Coast online class, which is basically this, but much more in depth, and we meet different species and talk a bit more about the details. There's the map of the intertidal, which I have as a free download from our Backcountry Press website. I have this ID and sustainable heart gathering guide, which is online, and also there's some back there at Karen's table. And then I have a cooking class online as well, and a field trip scheduled for an exceptionally low tide coming up on May 19th in Trinidad. And that is a Tuesday. Sorry, folks, you have to work. And because you've been so amazing, here is a picture of me enjoying seaweed all the way back in the 90s. Thank you. Yeah. May I answer any of your questions? Yes.
I saw a prediction for another El Nino this year.
I saw that too.
Are we worried about a blob?
I'm not sure what it takes to make a blob, but any rise in ocean temperatures is distressing for kelp forests worldwide. Yes.
Repeat the question.
So the spores that come out, they're swimming spores?
Yes.
Are they-
The spores that come out are swimming spores. Sorry, repeating for Zoom. Yes, male and female, they find each other. Alternation of generations. Yes.
Yeah. Like, before you can dry it, or is it just keep dry straight?
That is a great question. It was, do you have to do any other cleaning measures before you're drying the seaweed after you gather it from the ocean? My preference is to not clean the seaweed in fresh water. Fresh water degrades it so quickly. It also dramatically changes the flavor. I would say the only caveats there are if you get home and you're like, oh, this is actually kind of sandy and has a lot of little snails on it. It would be better to give it a quick dunk, and the snails do release very quickly in fresh water. Yeah, or if, like, if you look at what the guidelines are for collecting in the state of Washington, the state is telling you to wash your seaweed in fresh water first. And that's really to remove any maybe like topical contaminants or bacteria that have been hitching a ride. But personally, I don't recommend it if you can be collecting from the cleanest area possible. Okay, we're gonna call it quits. Thank you, everybody.
Allison, and I know everyone's excited, but maybe you can talk to Allison while touching her specimens up here in her tank and enjoying some refreshments, which are being put out right now on the back table. You can look at the merchandise, and thank you all for attending.